6 Australian soldiers walked into a jungle held by 600 enemy fighters. 14 minutes later, the Viet Cong Regiment ceased to exist as a fighting force. The Australian Army called it impossible. You think you know about Vietnam? You're wrong. How does a single patrol destroy a force 100 times their size? Why did the Americans study this battle for decades? What did these 6 men know that 50,000 US troops didn't? Stay until the end, because the answer changes. Everything we thought we knew about jungle warfare. August 18, 1966. The air in Phuoc, 2 province hangs thick enough to drink. Patrol Commander Harry Smith crouches in elephant grass, taller than a man, listening to sounds that don't belong. The metallic click of an AK-47 safety. The whisper of canvas against bamboo. The smell of nuoc mam fish sauce carried on wind that shouldn't exist in triple canopy jungle. His 5 men spread in a tactical formation, so tight they could touch fingertips, so silent insects resume their chorus within seconds. They've been moving for 43 hours without sleep, tracking a Viet Cong force at intelligence. SA didn't exist in this sector. Smith raises his fist. The patrol freezes. 700 meters ahead, through breaks in the vegetation, he counts cooking fires. Not the scattered arrangement of a temporary camp. The geometric precision of a regiment preparing for offensive operations. He scribbles coordinates on waterproof paper with hands that haven't trembled since Malaya. The numbers tell a story. That will reach Canberra within the hour and change the trajectory of Australia's war. The Australian Army Training Team, Vietnam, had been operating in country since 1962, 4 years before American ground combat units arrived in force. They came from a military tradition forged in different furnaces than their American allies, where U.S. doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower and rapid troop insertion. The Australians brought lessons written in the jungles of Malaya, New Guinea, and Borneo. They moved like ghosts through terrain that swallowed entire American companies. They learned to think like their enemy, to become part of the jungle rather than fight against it. When the first SAS patrols deployed to Phuoc II in 1966, they carried with them a philosophy the Viet Cong had never encountered. Patience married to violence so sudden it appeared supernatural. The numbers told a stark story. American units in 1966 typically achieved kill ratios of 3-to-1 in successful engagements, considered respectable given the nature of guerrilla warfare. The Australian SAS would finish their Vietnam deployment with documented ratios exceeding 30-to-1. In some individual actions, the disparity approached numbers military historians initially dismissed as clerical errors. These weren't exaggerations of body count inflation that plagued other Vietnam statistics. These were confirmed kills, verified by multiple sources, often with the weapons and documents to prove it. The Pentagon wanted to know how 6-man patrols accomplished what battalion-sized operations could not. The secret lived in the spaces between doctrine and reality. American forces in 1966 operated from a playbook written for European battlefields, modified imperfectly for jungle warfare. They moved in company strength, establishing fire support bases, calling artillery and airstrikes to compensate for limited visibility. The Viet Cong heard them coming from kilometers away. The distinctive thump of Huey helicopters, the crash of American soldiers through undergrowth, the chatter of multiple radios on predictable frequencies. By the time U.S. forces reached their objective, the enemy had melted into tunnel systems or crossed into Cambodia, leaving behind booby traps and frustration. The Australians came from different schools. The SAS selection course broke manhood, survived conventional infantry training, filtering for soldiers who could think independently while operating as seamless units. They learned to navigate by stars through a triple canopy, to move silently enough to surprise deer, to read the jungle's 1,000 microsignals that separated routine from ambush. A patrol might spend 14 hours covering 3 kilometers, stopping every few minutes to listen with an intensity that became meditative. They drank from streams by lying prone and sipping through cloth, leaving no trace. They defecated into plastic bags carried for the duration of the patrol. They became invisible, but invisibility meant nothing without the capacity for overwhelming violence when required. Each SAS soldier carried weapons loadouts that would seem excessive to conventional forces. The L1A1 rifle, the Australian version of the FNFAL, capable of accurate fire to 600 meters. The M60 machine gun, fed from belts that each patrol member carried portions of, was capable of sustained fire that could shred vegetation and everything behind it. Claymore mines positioned with geometric precision, creating killing zones no human could survive. And the personal skill to employ these weapons with accuracy that approached the supernatural under conditions where most soldiers couldn't see their own hands. Smith's patrol had tracked the 274th Viet Cong Regiment for 3 days, following signs invisible to untrained eyes. A broken twig with sap still wet, bootprints in mud under leaf litter. The faint ammonia smell of human waste is inadequately buried. Rice grains on a trail that saw no civilian traffic. Each indicator built a picture of enemy strength and direction. By the evening of August 17th, Smith knew he'd found something significant. By dawn on the 18th, observing from concealment, he understood he'd located the main force preparing for a major offensive against the Australian base. At Nui Dat Dot, the numbers didn't match the intelligence briefings. Briefings that promised scattered VC platoons, local force guerrillas of limited capability. Smith counted fighting positions for hundreds of soldiers. He observed heavy weapons crews servicing mortar and recoilless rifles. He watched officers conducting map studies over terrain models. This wasn't a guerrilla harassment force. This was a regiment preparing for conventional assault operations, equipped and trained to Chinese military doctrine. Confident enough to concentrate in strength because they believed the Australians hadn't found them. Smith's radio message reached Task Force headquarters with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized Australian military communications. No dramatic flourishes, grid coordinates, estimated enemy strength, composition, intention. The response came back within 20 minutes, faster than Smith expected. A full company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, would conduct a heliborne assault into landing zones north of the enemy position. Smith's patrol would remain in place, providing targeting information and ensuring the VC didn't slip away before the hammer fell. What intelligence hadn't told Smith, couldn't have told him because they didn't know themselves, was that the 274th Regiment had been reinforced. The actual strength approached 800 fighters, not the 300 estimated. They'd been training for this operation for months, rehearsing the assault on Nui Dat until every soldier could navigate the approach blindfolded. They'd studied Australian defensive patterns, identified weak points in the perimeter, calculated the timing required to breach the wire and reach the artillery positions before reaction forces could respond. They were confident. They were prepared. They were unaware that 6 Australians watched every movement, counting weapons, identifying leaders, mapping their entire order of battle. The helicopter insertion began at first light on August 19th. Iroquois helicopters carrying D Company 6 ARA, sweeping low over jungle that concealed an entire enemy regiment. The Viet Cong heard them coming, the inevitable cost of heliborne operations. But the VC commanders made a calculation that would prove catastrophic. Rather than scatter into prepared positions, they chose to maintain unit cohesion, believing their strength sufficient to maul an Australian company before withdrawing. They'd fought Australians before in small skirmishes. They'd won some, lost others, considered the Australians tough, but not substantially different from the Americans they'd been bleeding for years. This assumption died in the first 30 seconds of contact. D Company landed in 2 lifts, establishing a perimeter around landing zone, while Smith's patrol guided them toward the enemy position. The advance moved with characteristic Australian deliberation, each soldier covering assigned sectors, moving in bounds that never left gaps in the formation. They reached the edge of the plantation rubber trees at 1540 hours, transitioning from secondary jungle into the geometric rows of a long-abandoned plantation. The VC had chosen their defensive position with tactical sophistication, using the plantation's ordered spacing to create natural fields of fire while maintaining covered fighting positions in the undergrowth. The initial contact came at 1542 hours when the lead Australian section walked into an ambush position, occupied by approximately 40 Viet Cong fighters. The VC opened fire first, a calculated initiation designed to pin the Australians, while supporting elements maneuvered for envelopment. It was textbook small unit tactics, executed with discipline that reflected months of training. Against most forces, it would have worked. The Australians weren't most forces. The lead section went to ground and returned fire in movements, so practiced they appeared choreographed. The section commander identified the ambush positions in the first burst of enemy fire, reading muzzle flashes and the distinctive sound, signature of AK-47s versus SKS rifles. He directed his machine gunner to suppress the primary position, while riflemen engaged targets of opportunity. The exchange lasted perhaps 20 seconds before the section commander called for supporting fire from the following platoons. The Australian response came not in uncoordinated individual shooting, but in synchronized applications of overwhelming violence. The VC expected the Australians to pull back under fire, to break contact and call for artillery support or airstrikes. This was the American pattern they'd learned to exploit. Fix the enemy in place with the initial ambush, inflict casualties during the withdrawal, disappear before the supporting fires arrived. But the Australians didn't withdraw. They advanced into the ambush through controlled fire and movement, each element suppressing enemy positions while others maneuvered, pressing forward with a momentum that reversed the tactical equation. The VC fighters found themselves defending against an assault they'd initiated, absorbing accurate rifle fire from soldiers who seemed able to see through the jungle's concealment. The battle expanded with organic inevitability as both sides committed additional forces. The VC regiment commander, monitoring the engagement from his command post 500 meters to the rear, made a decision based on reasonable assumptions. The Australians had committed approximately 100 men to the Sioux engagement. His regiment fielded over 700 fighters, with heavy weapons positioned to support the defensive positions. He ordered his reserve companies forward, intending to envelop the Australian flanks and destroy D Company in detail. It was sound tactics against a conventionally thinking opponent. Harry Smith's patrol watched the VC reinforcements moving into position from their concealed observation post. Smith had remained in place during the heli-borne insertion, maintaining eyes on the broader battlefield that the committed infantry companies couldn't see. He observed the VC reserve companies moving through the jungle, following trails his patrol had already mapped. He counted approximately 300 additional fighters preparing to envelop D Company's exposed flanks. He called in targeting information with the calm precision of a man ordering lunch, providing grid coordinates and direction of movement for the enemy reinforcements. The Australian artillery knew that had been waiting for this moment. The guns had been laid on the coordinates Smith provided hours earlier, ammunition stacked and ready, fire missions plotted for every likely enemy avenue of approach. When the call came through, the guns fired within 40 seconds. The first rounds were marking shells, white phosphorus bursting over the jungle to orient the observers. Smith called corrections with mathematical precision. 100 left. Add 50. Fire for effect. The artillery fell on the VC reinforcements like steel rain. 105mm shells from the field artillery, augmented by 155mm rounds from American batteries providing fire support. The shells burst in the canopy and at ground level, creating overlapping kill zones that shredded vegetation and everything beneath it. The VC companies, moving in column formation along predictable trails, absorbed casualties that transformed organized units into scattered survivors in under 2 minutes. The regiment commander's envelope collapsed before it could form, victim of artillery directed by observers who'd spent 3 days mapping every meter of the killing ground. But the main VC force in the plantation remained combat effective and dangerous. They'd constructed fighting positions with overhead cover that protected against artillery airbursts. They had clear fields of fire through the rubber trees. They outnumbered the Australian company nearly 5-1, with heavy weapons including mortar and recoilless rifles. The tactical situation favored the defenders, basic infantry mathematics that hadn't changed since armies first fought from. Prepared positions. Under conventional doctrine, the company should have fixed the enemy in place and called for additional forces before attempting to assault fortified positions held by vastly superior numbers. The Australians fixed nothing. They were assaulted. The attack developed through small unit actions that created compound effects that VC couldn't counter. Individual sections identified weak points in the enemy line through aggressive patrolling under fire, probing for positions where suppressive fire created opportunities for maneuver. When they found such positions, they exploited them instantly, without waiting for approval from higher command. Section commanders directed supporting machine gun fire with hand signals. Rifle sections moved during the suppression, and in seconds, they'd flanked positions that should have required platoon-level assaults to reduce. The VC found themselves fighting in 3 dimensions simultaneously, defending against frontal pressure, while trying to counter flanking movements that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The intensity of the Australian fire created psychological effects beyond the physical. Damage. Each Australian rifle fired semi-automatic, but the soldiers fired so rapidly and accurately it sounded like automatic weapons. The distinctive crack of the L1A1 became continuous, merged with the hammering of M60 machine guns into a wall of sound that made communication impossible for the defending VC. They couldn't hear their officers shouting orders. They couldn't coordinate their defense. They fought as individuals rather than a cohesive unit, and individuals couldn't stand against the Australian assault. The VC tried to employ their heavy weapons, firing recoilless rifles at Australian positions, and launching mortar rounds into the plantation. The return fire was instantaneous and devastating. Australian soldiers identified heavy weapons positions by their muzzle signatures and engaged with concentrated rifle and machine gun fire that killed or scattered the crews. The few mortar rounds that landed among the Australians caused casualties, but not enough to slow the assault's momentum. The wounded retreated in place or dragged to covered positions by section medics who moved through the firefight with the same calm efficiency they'd show in a training exercise. Smith's patrol, still observing from the jungle edge, called additional artillery strikes on VC positions beyond D Company's immediate front. The shells walked through the rubber plantation in geometric patterns, isolating portions of the enemy force, preventing reinforcement or withdrawal. The VC regiment, fragmented into isolated groups, fighting separate battles, unable to mass their superior numbers against any single point. The tactical advantage dissolved in artillery smoke, and the relentless Australian advance at approximately 16:30 hours Elements of D Company reached the VC command post. They identified it by the sudden increase in document debris and the presence of officers attempting to organize a withdrawal. The Australians killed them with the same mechanical efficiency they'd shown throughout the engagement. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Aimed fire at identified targets, verification of the kill, movement to the next position. The VC regimental commander died attempting to rally his headquarters security element, shot 3 times by a rifleman, who'd identified him by his map case and binoculars. The collapse came suddenly. One moment the VC force maintained defensive cohesion in isolated pockets. The next, soldiers began withdrawing without orders, and running, abandoning weapons and equipment in favor of speed. The regiment broke. The Australians didn't pursue into the darkening jungle where the advantage would shift to the surviving VC. They consolidated positions, established defensive perimeters, and waited for morning to conduct battle damage assessment. Dawn revealed a battlefield that shocked even the Australians who'd fought across it. The rubber plantation looked like an artillery testing range. Trees shattered, ground churned, fighting positions collapsed. They found bodies in quantities that required careful counting to believe. Weapons enough to equip a battalion. Documents that revealed the full scope of what they prevented. The planned assault on Nui Dat that would have struck the Australian base with overwhelming force if the regiment had reached its jump-off positions undetected. The official count settled at 245 confirmed enemy dead, with blood trails and drag marks suggesting hundreds more casualties evacuated. During the night, D Company suffered 18 dead and 24 wounded, tragic numbers that nonetheless represented a kill ratio of over 13-1. When Smith's patrol casualties were calculated, the numbers became more stark. His 6-man patrol had spent 4 days in contact with enemy forces orders of magnitude larger. They'd guided artillery that killed over 100 enemy soldiers. They'd provided the intelligence that made the entire operation possible. And they'd suffered 0 casualties. The Americans studied the Battle of Long Tan, as it came to be called, with the intensity of students examining a master's thesis. The U.S. Army sent observers to interview the participants, to walk the ground, to understand how a reinforced company had destroyed a regiment while suffering casualties that wouldn't rate a footnote in most American operations. The observers focused on the artillery, assuming that supporting fires explained the lopsided results. They missed the deeper lesson that the Australians tried to explain, but couldn't quite articulate in ways that translated to American doctrine. The artillery mattered, certainly. But artillery alone didn't account for Australian success. American forces had access to supporting fires that made Australian capabilities seem modest. They could call naval gunfire, Air Force strikes, helicopter gunships, artillery from multiple batteries. They had more firepower available than any military force in history. Yet they weren't achieving Australian-style results. The difference lived in the infantry's fundamental approach to combat. Australian infantry, Vietnam moved like apex predators. They were patient in approach, violent in execution, disciplined in consolidation. They spent days or weeks stalking their prey, learning the terrain, identifying patterns, waiting for the moment when conditions favored action. When they struck with overwhelming force concentrated at decisive points, creating local superiority that offset strategic enemy advantages. And when the killing ended, they controlled their positions with the same calm professionalism they'd shown in the assault. No wild chasing of broken enemies into areas that negated their advantages. No exposing themselves to counterattack in the adrenaline aftermath of victory. The SAS took these principles to their logical extreme. Where conventional infantry operated in company or platoon strength, SAS patrols consisted of 4 to 6 men. Where conventional forces established fire support bases and conducted operations from fixed positions, SAS patrols lived in the jungle for weeks at a time, resupplied by helicopter insertions so brief the VC rarely detected them. Where conventional forces fought their way to objectives, SAS patrols appeared at objectives after days of silent approach. Delivered violence so sudden it seemed to materialize from nowhere and vanished back into the jungle before effective. Response could develop. The statistics from Australian SAS operations read like fiction. Patrol reports documented enemy kills in numbers that seemed impossible for 4 or 6 men to achieve. A patrol would observe a VC base camp for 3 days, mapping every position, counting every fighter, identifying leaders by their movements and behavior. Then they'd call artillery or airstrikes on the camp while maintaining observation, adjusting. Fire onto fleeing survivors, ensuring complete destruction of the targeted unit. Or they'd set an ambush with such precision that an entire enemy platoon walked into a killing zone where claymore mines and automatic weapons. Fire erased them from existence in under 10 seconds. The VC learned to fear areas where Australian forces operated. The jungle that had been their sanctuary became hostile, filled with hunters who could track them through terrain they thought they owned. VC units began refusing to operate in Phuong Chu province, claiming the spirits of the forest had turned against them. It wasn't spirits. It was soldiers who'd mastered their environment so completely they seemed supernatural to enemies accustomed to American patterns. One SAS patrol, operating near the Saigon River in late 1966, observed a VC battalion moving into a staging area for operations against nearby American forces. The patrol consisted of 5 men, led by a sergeant with the improbable name of Bob. They'd been in position for 6 days, living in hide sites so carefully constructed that VC soldiers walked within meters without detecting them. They watched the battalion arrive, approximately 400 fighters with heavy weapons and supply elements. They counted cooking fires, identified the command element, mapped the defensive positions. Bob called in the intelligence and received authorization to direct strikes on the target. Over the next 4 hours, Australian artillery and American airstrikes pounded the VC positions with methodical precision. Bob adjusted fire with the calm of a teacher correcting homework, walking the shells through every section of the camp. When the strikes lifted, the patrol conducted a battle damage assessment from their concealed positions, observing survivors attempting to reorganize. Bob called more strikes on the new positions. The process repeated until the VC battalion ceased to exist as a coherent force. The patrol exfiltrated that night, having destroyed a battalion without firing their personal weapons, without being detected, without suffering a single casualty. The Pentagon sent tactical analysis teams to study these operations. They interviewed the Australian patrol leaders, walked the ground where the actions occurred, tried to codify the techniques into doctrine that American forces could employ. The resulting manuals captured some of the mechanics. Move slowly. Maintain. Noise discipline. Use terrain for concealment. Trust supporting fires. But they couldn't capture the mindset, the fundamental philosophical difference in how Australians approached jungle warfare. American forces in 1966 fought to find the enemy. They conducted search and destroy operations, sweeping through areas of suspected enemy presence, hoping to make contact that would allow them to employ their superior firepower. The very concept of search and destroy revealed the underlying assumption. The enemy was hidden, and American forces needed to locate them before combat could occur. This assumption led to tactics that prioritized speed of movement and broad area coverage over stealth and detailed reconnaissance. Australians didn't search for the enemy. They tracked the enemy. The distinction seems semantic until you understand the practical implications. Tracking required different skills, different patience, different ways of reading the environment. An American patrol might cover 10 kilometers in a day, moving rapidly through their assigned area, looking for obvious signs of enemy presence. An Australian patrol might cover 3 kilometers in the same time, stopping frequently to observe, reading subtle indicators that revealed enemy movements from hours or days earlier, building a picture of enemy patterns that allowed them to predict where contact would occur rather than hoping to stumble into it. This tracking methodology created an intelligence picture that conventional forces couldn't match. Australian patrols knew their areas of operation with intimate detail. They could tell you which trails the VC used, which water sources, which areas they avoided. They knew where the VC established temporary camps, how long they stayed, what they were doing there. This knowledge accumulated over weeks and months, each patrol adding to a collective understanding that made the VC predictable. And predictable enemies, no matter how skilled or numerous, couldn't survive against soldiers who knew their patterns. The M60 machine gun became a symbol of this approach, carried by SAS patrols despite its weight. In American hands, the M60 provided suppressive fire to support maneuver, hosing down enemy positions with sustained bursts that forced the enemy to keep their heads down while rifle sections moved. Effective, certainly, but wasteful of ammunition and revealing of the shooter's position. In Australian hands, the M60 became a precision instrument. Australian machine gunners fired in short, controlled bursts, 3 to 5 rounds per trigger. Pull, aiming each burst at specific targets rather than general areas. They achieved similar suppressive effects with a fraction of the ammunition, maintaining their position security because the brief muzzle flashes didn't reveal their exact locations. This precision extended to every weapon system the Australians employed. Riflemen fired aimed shots rather than spraying bullets toward enemy positions. Artillery forward observers called for precise fire missions on specific targets rather than blanketing areas with shells. Even grenade usage followed patterns of calculated violence rather than reflexive response. An Australian soldier might carry a dozen grenades on patrol, but use only 2 or 3 during an entire contact, throwing them at specifically identified positions where they'd have maximum effect. The psychology was different. American doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower to compensate for limited visibility and uncertainty about enemy positions. Australian doctrine emphasized patient observation to remove uncertainty, then surgical application of violence against known enemy positions. The results spoke through statistics that military analysts initially refused to believe. Australian forces in Vietnam suffered the lowest casualty rates of any Allied ground combat units while achieving the highest confirmed kill ratios. The numbers weren't even close. Australian casualties ran approximately 1/5 of American casualties per 1,000 troops deployed. Australian kill ratios averaged 5 times higher than American ratios. Individual SAS patrols achieved kill ratios that exceeded 50 to 1 in documented engagements. These weren't anomalies or statistical outliers. They were consistent patterns maintained across 4 years of combat operations. The VC understood they faced something different when they encountered Australians. Documents captured from VC units contained specific warnings about Australian tactics. Don't move during the day in areas of Australian operations. Don't use established trails. Don't establish patterns in camp locations or movement times. Don't assume you haven't been observed, even if you see no enemy. The warnings revealed a grudging respect for an enemy who turned the jungle against them, but respect didn't prevent the VC from trying to adapt. They attempted to ambush Australian patrols using the same tactics that worked against American forces. They set up ambush positions along likely patrol routes, using superior numbers and prepared positions to offset Australian advantages in firepower and training. It rarely worked. Australian patrols moving through potential ambush areas employed counter-ambush drills that turned the tactical situation inside out. The lead scout moved with exaggerated caution through danger areas, drawing fire if an ambush existed. The moment shots rang out, the scout went to ground, while the rest of the patrol executed rehearsed responses that placed devastating fire on the ambush positions from unexpected directions. What should have been a successful VC ambush became a hasty Australian assault that left dead VC fighters and captured weapons. The VC tried mining trails that Australian patrols used. The Australians stopped using trails except when tactical situations required it, and then moved in formations that dispersed blast effects from any mine detonation. They learned to read the subtle ground disturbances that indicated recently buried mines. They developed a sixth sense for areas that felt wrong, trusting instincts developed through constant exposure to the jungle environment. Mine casualties among Australian forces ran significantly below the rates suffered by American units operating in similar terrain. The VC tried rocket and mortar attacks on Australian base camps, using the same harassment tactics that killed and wounded American soldiers by the hundreds. Australian defensive positions incorporated overhead cover that defeated most mortar fragments. Bunkers and fighting positions were engineered to proper military standards rather than hastily constructed. Early warning systems and counter-battery radar allowed Australian artillery to respond to VC firing positions with devastating accuracy. The VC learned that shooting at Australian bases frequently resulted in artillery strikes on their own positions within minutes, a poor trade-off that discouraged persistent harassment. Every tactical adaptation the VC attempted ran into Australian responses that seemed to anticipate the enemy's thoughts. This wasn't psychic ability or superior intelligence. This was the natural result of soldiers who thought like their enemy because they'd studied the enemy with obsessive attention to detail. Australian patrol reports read like anthropological studies documenting VC behavior patterns with academic precision, how they moved through terrain, what times of day they conducted various activities, how they reacted to different stimuli, what mistakes they made repeatedly. This knowledge base allowed Australian commanders to predict enemy behavior with accuracy that appeared supernatural, but was actually just thorough professional study. The broader American military establishment struggled to incorporate these lessons. Part of the challenge was structural. The Australian Army was smaller, more selective, and operated within a military culture that emphasized individual initiative within disciplined frameworks. The American military machine in Vietnam numbered over 500,000 personnel by 1968, a bureaucracy too large to maintain Australian-style standards across all units. You couldn't train every American soldier to SAS standards. You couldn't give every platoon leader the authority to make decisions that Australian corporals made routinely. The institutional frameworks were different, and changing them would have required rebuilding the entire military culture. But another part of the challenge was philosophical. American military culture in the 1960s had been shaped by World War II and Korea, conflicts where industrial capacity and firepower superiority determined outcomes. The idea that patience and stealth might achieve more than bombs and artillery ran counter to institutional assumptions about how modern warfare worked. Senior American commanders looked at Australian operations and saw interesting tactical variations, not fundamental truths about how to fight guerrilla wars in jungle terrain. They took notes on specific techniques while missing the underlying philosophy that made those techniques effective. Some American units did adopt Australian methods with remarkable success. The 173rd Airborne Brigade operated in areas adjacent to Australian forces and began incorporating Australian tactical principles into their operations. They slowed their movement rates, increased their observation time, and reduced their noise signatures. Their casualty rates dropped. Their enemy. Contact rates increased. Their kill ratios improved dramatically. But these were local adaptations by specific units, not systemic changes to American doctrine. The fundamental difference persisted throughout the war. American forces continued to emphasize finding and fixing the enemy so firepower could be employed. Australian forces continued to track and ambush the enemy at moments of maximum advantage. The American approach achieved tactical successes that looked impressive on maps and in statistics. The Australian approach achieved tactical successes that ended with dead enemy fighters and living Australian soldiers in ratios that made American successes seem costly by comparison. Harry Smith returned to Australia in 1967 after a year in Vietnam, decorated for his actions at Long Tan and the months of patrol operations that preceded it. He would eventually rise to lieutenant colonel before retiring, his career marked by the battle that proved Australian tactical doctrine superior to the conventional wisdom that dominated Allied operations in Vietnam. But he never viewed Long Tan as a victory of Australian forces over American methods. He saw it as a victory of patience over haste, preparation over improvisation, professional military art over bureaucratic process. The SAS continued operations in Vietnam until 1971, maintaining their impossible statistics until the last patrol exfiltrated from Phuoc Thu province. They left behind a legacy written in enemy casualties and their own survival rates. Over the course of Australian operations in Vietnam, SAS patrols documented over 2,000 confirmed enemy kills, while suffering fewer than 40 patrol member deaths, a ratio that defied every statistical model of guerrilla warfare. These weren't exaggerated body counts or clerical fiction. These were confirmed kills with weapons and documents to prove it, verified through multiple sources, accepted even by skeptical military historians who initially assumed the numbers reflected Australian propaganda. The captured VC documents told their own story. After the war, researchers gained access to Vietnamese military archives and found references to Australian operations in numerous after-action reports and tactical directives. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong treated encounters with Australian forces as qualitatively different from encounters with American forces. They suffered casualties they couldn't sustain in areas where Australians operated. They learned that American forces could be ambushed, harassed, and bled through patient guerrilla tactics. They learned that Australian forces were the hunters, and trying to ambush hunters typically resulted in the ambush party's destruction. One Vietnamese document, a directive from a provincial VC commander to subordinate units, stated the lesson explicitly. Do not engage Australian forces unless you have overwhelming superiority and the element of surprise. Do not assume you have either. Withdraw from areas of known Australian presence. Report Australian patrol activity immediately to higher command. Avoid contact. The directive reversed the entire guerrilla warfare equation. Instead of guerrillas ambushing conventional forces had become ghosts that guerrillas couldn't predict or counter. The lessons from Vietnam faded quickly in the American military psyche after the war ended. The institutional narrative focused on why America lost, producing explanations centered on political constraints, media coverage, and public support. The tactical victories achieved by forces who understood jungle warfare received less attention, perhaps because those victories didn't fit the narrative of inevitable failure. Australian operations got mentioned in staff studies and professional journals, usually as interesting footnotes to the broader story of American involvement in Southeast Asia. But Special Operations Forces remembered the U.S. military's development of modern special operations doctrine drew heavily on Australian Vietnam experience, even when the institutional knowledge came secondhand or through informal channels. The emphasis on small unit tactics, detailed reconnaissance, patient stalking of enemy forces, and sudden violence at moments of maximum advantage became hallmarks of American special operations in the decades after Vietnam. Delta Force, SEA, Team 6, Army Special Forces, Marine Special Operations Command all incorporated lessons that the Australian SAS had written in Vietnamese blood. The M60 machine gun eventually gave way to newer systems, but the philosophy of precision violence remained. Modern special operations units employ machine guns with the same controlled bursts and aimed fire that Australian SAS patrols pioneered in Phuoc Thu Province. The weapons changed, the tactics evolved. The underlying approach stayed consistent because it was proven in combat against a skilled, determined enemy who had home field advantage and still lost catastrophically when confronted by soldiers who understood patience as a weapon system. The six-man patrol remained the gold standard for special reconnaissance operations. American Special Operations Forces might deploy in slightly larger elements for specific missions, but the basic building block stayed the same. 6 men small enough to move silently through hostile terrain, large enough to carry the weapons, and equipment necessary to call down devastating firepower or execute their own ambushes, trained to function as a single organism where each member knew his role so thoroughly that verbal communication became unnecessary in combat. The organizational structure that Harry Smith's patrol exemplified in 1966 became the template that Special Operations Forces worldwide adopted in subsequent decades. The rubber plantation at Long Tan returned to the jungle within years of the battle. The plantation owners never came back after the war. The orderly rows of rubber trees disappeared under secondary growth and primary jungle. The fighting positions filled with leaves and rain and time. By the 1980s, you couldn't walk the ground and see evidence of the battle that had occurred there. The jungle reclaimed everything, the way the jungle always does when humans stop maintaining their temporary clearings. But the tactical lessons proved more permanent than the physical scars. Military academies studied Long Tan as a perfect example of combined arms coordination, where infantry, artillery, and air support functioned as integrated components of a single weapon system. They examined Harry Smith's patrol as a case study in reconnaissance that enables decisive action. They analyzed D Company's assault as proof that disciplined infantry can defeat larger forces holding prepared positions when the attacking force maintains momentum and exploits every advantage of training and cohesion. What they sometimes missed, because it's harder to codify in military doctrine, was the psychology that made Australian tactics effective. The Australian soldiers who fought at Long Tan and in hundreds of smaller actions across Phuoc Thu Province didn't think of themselves as superhuman. They were professionals doing their jobs according to standards they'd internalized through selection and training. They approached combat with the same methodical competence that a master craftsman brings to his work. No heroics, no dramatic gestures, just professional application of military skills against enemy forces who faced the same jungle, the same heat, the same fear, but lacked the same preparation and cohesion. The VC fighters who died in that rubber plantation weren't cowards or incompetents. They were soldiers who'd been fighting for years, who defeated French colonial forces and given American forces endless grief. They had courage, commitment, and tactical skill. They died because they encountered a force that was better prepared, better trained, and better led at the critical moment when battles were decided. No amount of courage compensates for being caught in artillery, barrages called by observers who've spent days learning your exact positions. No amount of tactical skill saves you when you're assaulting enemy positions that can predict your movements because they've studied your patterns. The VC lost at Long Tan not because they were inferior soldiers, but because they faced opponents who'd mastered their profession more completely the deeper lesson transcended specific battles or tactical techniques. Harry Smith's patrol succeeded because 6 men spent days doing unglamorous work in miserable conditions, observing rather than acting, gathering information rather than seeking contact. They succeeded because the Australian military culture valued this patient approach enough to train soldiers in its execution and trust them to apply it without constant supervision. They succeeded because someone in the Australian command structure understood that 6 well-trained soldiers with good intelligence and artillery support could achieve more than a battalion of average soldiers conducting conventional operations. The American military had access to all the same tools: better artillery, more helicopters, superior air support, unlimited ammunition. The difference lived in how those tools were employed. American forces tended to use firepower as a primary tactic, overwhelming enemy positions with steel and high explosive. Australian forces tended to use firepower as an enabler of infantry tactics, supporting maneuver rather than substituting for it. Both approaches could win battles. One approach won them at dramatically lower cost. The cost matters not just in casualty statistics, but in what those casualties represent. Every Australian soldier who came home alive from Vietnam was a soldier who'd accumulated combat experience. That couldn't be replaced. Every American soldier killed or wounded was a soldier whose experience died with him or was removed from the force when medical evacuation sent him home. Over time, this created experience differentials that compounded. Australian units in 1970 contained soldiers with 4 years of combat experience. Led by officers who'd been fighting since 1966, American units in 1970 rotated personnel through 1-year tours that prevented institutional knowledge from accumulating. The Australian approach maintained combat effectiveness through unit cohesion and experience retention. The American approach constantly rebuilt unit capabilities as experienced soldiers rotated home and inexperienced replacements arrived. There's poetry in the image of 6 men walking into a jungle held by 600, emerging victorious not through miracle, but through professional competence applied with ruthless consistency. It contradicts the narratives we tell ourselves about warfare, narratives that emphasize size and firepower and technological advantage. It suggests that sometimes the quieter virtues matter more: patience to observe rather than act, discipline to execute plans under conditions where discipline means the difference between life and death, professional skill developed through training that breaks most candidates before they earn the right to serve. The jungle eventually reclaimed the rubber plantation at Long Tan, but the jungle never reclaimed the tactical space that Australian forces had dominated. Long after Australian troops withdrew from Vietnam, their methods lived on in the special operations units of militaries worldwide: the 6-man patrol, the patient reconnaissance, the sudden violence, the discipline that turned jungle from enemy territory into hunting ground. Harry Smith's patrol didn't change the outcome of the Vietnam War. No single action could have changed a conflict determined by political forces beyond military control. But they changed the tactical equation in ways that created effects far beyond the 600 enemy fighters they helped destroy. They proved that asymmetric warfare cuts both ways, that guerrillas can be hunted as effectively as they hunt, that the side with fewer numbers can dominate if those numbers consist of individuals trained to higher standards and employed with superior tactical acumen. The legacy lives wherever soldiers move silently through hostile terrain, trusting that patience will create opportunities that haste never could. It lives in the doctrine manuals that now emphasize reconnaissance and intelligence as prerequisites for successful operations. It lives in the selection courses that break candidates who lack the mental resilience to remain effective under conditions where most humans would collapse. It lives in the quiet confidence of professionals who understand their craft so completely they make the impossible appear routine. 6 men walked into a jungle held by 600 enemies. They emerged with intelligence that destroyed a regiment. They didn't do it through magic or superhuman ability. They did it through professional military competence, applied with patience and precision. That's the lesson the Pentagon studied for decades. That's the truth that changes everything about how we understand jungle warfare. That's why Harry Smith's patrol matters 40 years after the rubber trees reclaimed the battlefield where history was written in coordinates and corpses, and the silent movement of soldiers who'd mastered their profession completely.